Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And first of all, I would like to thank the Islamic Renaissance Front for inviting me to take part in this discussion. I will just make a few brief comments about the book, because that's our focus today. And then I'll probably, it would be good to have a discussion rather than me giving a very long lecture on contextualist approaches to the Qur'an. I guess most of us probably would ask why we need yet another approach to interpreting the Qur'an. We have plenty of approaches in our tradition. Can you hear me at the back?
You have to speak louder.
I have to speak. Okay. Okay. Well, many of us would be asking the question, why do we need yet another approach to interpreting the Qur'an? We have plenty of approaches in our tradition to interpret the Qur'an. Let us think of some examples first. Recently, the ISIS declared that slavery should be practiced, and they used certain Quranic verses to justify their position. Their view is, well, this is in the Qur'an recognized slavery, and Islamic tradition also recognized that, and we see the evidence of that in classical Islamic legal texts. And that was abolished formally by Muslim states and Muslims pretty much in the 20th century. So their position is, if we have these verses in the Qur'an, why shouldn't we continue practicing that? That's slavery. And if you look at the views of some Muslims about the role of men and women in society, quite a lot of them would say, well, we have Quranic verses to justify some of the attitudes that we have in Muslim societies about women. And one can find many, many other examples of that nature. There are Muslims who would argue for certain positions, certain attitudes towards non-Muslims based on certain Quranic verses. The question is, how should we engage with these texts? Yes, for much of our tradition, for the last 1400 years, the interpretations of these texts remained unchallenged. There was no need for that. But in the modern period, our context has changed significantly. The social, political, cultural, intellectual context of our time is quite different to the context in the pre-modern times. So many of us, Muslim scholars, thinkers, are exploring ways of engaging with these texts in the Qur'an. At the end of the day, the Qur'an for us Muslims is our most important text. That is our guide, ethical, moral guide to us, for us. And we have to make sense of that in the modern period. We can't just simply say, well, the context has changed and therefore there's no need for the Qur'an. We can't take that position. The Qur'an is always our guide. But the question is, how do we understand it? So this particular book that we are discussing tonight is really a contribution to that debate. In the book, I use some key terms like context. Context is a term that you see a lot in the book. Contextualist, textualist, and the like. I'm not going to go through all these terms, but let me just highlight some of these terms. What exactly does context mean for me? Well, context can be understood at two different levels. Context can be, context of a text I mean. Context can mean the linguistic context, which I call the micro context, which is really the linguistic context in which a particular phrase or particular word occurs in the Qur'an. And in our Islamic tradition, we have a lot of debates on that, and Muslim scholars have done a lot of work to deal with that micro context. The second way in which I use the term context is what I call macro context. Macro context is really the social, political, cultural, intellectual, economic context, and this can be looked at two different levels again. Macro context of the early Islam, that is really the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, early 7th century, how things were in Mecca and Medina particularly, and the western part of Arabia in general. What was the social life like? What was the political situation like? What were the kinds of ideas that existed in that society as far as cultural values, social values, norms and practices are concerned? What was the intellectual life like? And how, as far as men and women are concerned, what kind of ideas existed there for the relations between men and women and the like? So, and that's macro context one. Macro context two is what is happening right now. What is our context now like? Social, political, intellectual, cultural, economic context. And we don't really ignore what happened between the early 7th century and the 21st century either. This is where I use the phrase connector context. Connector context is the context through which a particular reading of the Quranic text went through between the early 7th century and the 21st century. These are some of the terms, and a couple of other terms. I use the term textualist and contextualist. A textualist is a person who puts a lot of emphasis on the linguistic meaning of the text and wants to maintain also the past understandings of the text today. Very heavy emphasis on the linguistic meaning and a literal reading of the text where possible, and want to maintain the past understandings of the text as we have inherited in our tradition. A contextualist would say that focus on linguistic meaning is fine, but we need to go a lot beyond the linguistic meaning of the text and also beyond the past understandings. A contextualist would argue that we need to take into account the context of the text in the early 7th century and the context of the same text in the 21st century, as well as the contexts through which the text actually moved between the early 7th century and the 21st century. So it is not a simple understanding of the text. It's a lot more complex. Linguistic meaning is very important, but a contextualist would go beyond that. I'll give some examples later on. So what exactly then is a contextual or contextualist approach to the text? A contextualist approach to the text simply is an approach that gives due recognition to the way the text was understood at the beginning of Islam, the early 7th century, and also tries to relate that understanding to our context today, without trying to distort the basic linguistic meaning of the text. It is an attempt to relate the meaning of the text to changing contexts. Now, you might ask, if we follow that approach, aren't we going to come up with meanings that would be different to different people, to different contexts? I'll come to that question in a minute. But what are the kinds of texts of the Qur'an that can be used in this contextual approach? So when we look at the Qur'an, we have a whole range of different types of texts. We have what we might call theological texts. These are texts related to God, life after death, paradise, hell, accountability, and the like. Contextualist approach is not particularly interested in those texts, because those texts are, when you interpret them in the early 7th century or the 21st century, the interpretation would be very similar. There are also what we might call historically oriented texts or historical texts. These are texts that are associated with past communities, prophetic figures and their communities, Prophet Moses, Prophet Jesus, and the like. And again, these are historical texts, and a contextual reading might not be very helpful. The focus of contextual approach to the Qur'an is very much on one particular type of text, that is what I call ethico-legal texts. These are texts that are associated with our beliefs, our practices such as the prayers, fasting, pilgrimage, and the like, as well as rules and regulations, halal and haram, these kinds of texts that have an ethical legal emphasis in them. Obviously, not all of these texts would be very heavily used in a contextualist approach. For example, texts related to prayer, fasting, pilgrimage. These are settled, and there is no need for us to say we need to contextualize them. Texts that are related to halal and haram, which are what is permissible, what is prohibited in Islam, are also very well known and understood, and there is no need for us to say what is halal and what is haram. As far as the Quran is concerned, that's very clearly settled. We can obviously discuss the details. For example, in the Quran it is very clearly stated that riba is haram. We all know what riba is, or we have a rough idea of what that is. وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى. Harram al-riba means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibited riba. And now in the 21st century, I can't say, well, let's question this. The contextual approach would question this understanding. No, contextual approach would not touch that. Riba is haram, it's very clear. But what we can debate is, what exactly is riba? Is the understanding that we all have of riba today is really the understanding? Now, for most of us, I don't know, for many of us, or for many Muslims, when they hear the term riba, it means what? Interest. We can debate that, but let's not get into that. That's maybe for another day. So, coming back to the types of texts that contextualist approach would be interested in, it is the ethico-legal text. Not all of them, certain ethico-legal texts that if we use contextualist approach, it could lead to more relevant understandings in our time. I started off with examples of texts that are related to men and women relations, violence, attitudes towards people of other faiths, slavery, and the like. These are the kinds of texts that would be heavily used in a contextualist approach. Without getting into too much detail, I would say that in the book I went through a series of steps to make it easier for people if they want to use this particular approach. How are they going to use that? So I had 4-step analysis of a particular text. Let's say if you take an example, chapter 4, verse 34, which is الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم. Basically, this is one of the most controversial verses that many of us deal with today. Many so-called Muslim feminists would actually look at this particular verse and try to analyze that, try to understand that. Now, this is a good example of a Quranic verse that can be analyzed, looked at based on a contextual approach. Let me just give a rough idea of this. I mean, traditionally, Muslim scholars, whether you look at Tabari, Razi, Qurtubi, Zamakhshari, most of the mufassirs or commentators on the Quran would have approached this particular verse in a very similar way. And you go through the commentaries, you find very similar understandings of this particular verse. Coming to the modern period, when you look at the interpretations or translations of the Quran today and go through some examples, you will find the difficulties some Muslim scholars are having with regard to the traditional understanding. I'll give some examples. If you look at someone like Abdullah Yusuf Ali's translation, Abdullah Yusuf Ali is an Indian Muslim who published his commentary or translation in the early 30s. And he's considered a modernist Muslim scholar. And he would say something like, as far as the meaning is concerned, men are protectors and maintainers of women. And then he goes on to give 2 reasons that are mentioned in the verse. The verse is a very long one. I'm just looking at the very first part of the verse. If you look at someone like Pictol, who is an English convert to Islam, again his translation from roughly the same period, he would say men are in charge of women, because then it gives 2 reasons. But if you look at someone like Abdul Halim, whose translation was published in the early 21st century, he would say something like this: husbands should take good care of their wives. You see the difference in commentaries? So what is going on? The Arabic text is the same. الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم. Arabic text hasn't changed. The understanding of different scholars has changed. If you look at the classical tradition, there's roughly roughly a very similar understanding. That for them, there was a hierarchy between men and women. Men, women. That hierarchy was part of their thinking. But this kind of thinking is not quite appropriate in our time. The context has changed. the social, political, intellectual, cultural context has changed. Women have same opportunities as men, same education, same opportunities, same jobs, same income, whole lot of other things. The ideas that many of our early Muslim scholars, pre-modern Muslim scholars had about women, that they are intellectually inferior, or they have this problem, that problem. Contemporary research tells us that a lot of these views are not really, good, or they don't have any evidence to support that. Women are as capable as men intellectually. They run countries, they run companies, they're major researchers. There's nothing to suggest that women are inferior to men. But these ideas did exist in pre-modern times. So how then should you read a text like that today? This is where people like Abdul Halim are approaching the text somewhat differently. And his reading of that is, husbands should take good care of their wives, because there are two reasons given in that verse. The first part says, بِمَا فَضَّلَ اللَّهُ بَعْضَهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. The ba in Arabic is to state a reason. Because God has given some advantages to some over others. The Qur'an doesn't say to men over women or to women over men. That's not there. The word ba'd is gender neutral. And the second reason is وَبِمَا أَنفَقُوا مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ, and because of what they spend from their wealth. So there's an economic reason, and there is another reason that's more related to the cultural context. Obviously, in early Islam and also in pre-modern times, in most societies, men had lot more advantages over women. They made decisions for the society, politically, economically they were stronger, and the like. So socially and culturally they were stronger. But in the 21st century, in the societies that we are living now, let's say in Malaysia or Australia, this idea that women can't do this, women won't be able to contribute to the society and the like, they're not there. Women are as capable as men to contribute, to create wealth, to manage societies, to manage the economy and the like. Now, Abdul Halim is not distorting the meaning of the text. He is very much reading the words in the verse in context. See, ar-rijal in Arabic can mean literally men. The men, al means the, rijal means men. So Abdullah Yusuf Ali and others are actually taking the literal meaning of the word. But in the context of the family in which this verse occurs, ar-rijal can mean husbands too. In Arabic, that's perfectly acceptable to use ar-rijal for husbands, although literally it means men. And in the same way, nisa can be used for wives, although literally nisa means women. So Abdul Halim is using the context as a basis for his reading of the text. I'm not going to spend too much time on how different scholars analyze the text, but you can see the point. A lot of these Muslim scholars who are very aware of significant difference between our context and pre-modern context are trying to come to terms with that. Now, this is not about playing, linguistic gymnastics or anything of that sort. Obviously, there will be some phrases in the Qur'an that might not be particularly comfortable to us because our values have changed and the like. No, we have to take them at face value. We shouldn't be trying to twist the basic meaning of the texts. But we can say that although this is the basic linguistic meaning of the text, how this text can be applied, how the meaning can be applied in our context can be different. Recognizing the linguistic meaning and then recognizing the application of that in our time. That's something that is doable. In fact, Muslim scholars have done that for many, many centuries. Coming back to the contextualist approach and the critiques by opponents of this approach. Opponents of this approach would argue that this is not an acceptable approach. This is not something that is coming from our tradition. This is an innovation. This is a liberal approach to the text. So they would use these labels to discredit this. But is this so new? Is the contextualist approach so new? My sense is, in our tradition, we have a lot to support the idea of taking context into account. Let me give some examples. See, quite a lot of Quranic verses would not be well understood if we ignore the biography of the Prophet. Seerah, the biography of the Prophet, is very important for us to understand certain Quranic verses. Verses related to the Battle of Badr, Battle of Uhud, or a whole lot of things that were happening in Medina and Mecca. Without having a good sense of the seerah or the biography of the Prophet, we would not have a very good understanding of those texts. This is context. The context of the seerah is important for understanding certain Quranic verses. Then we have asbab al-nuzul, or the occasions of the revelation. Again, this is something that is very well known in the tafsir tradition and also in the fiqh tradition. Now, having a sense of the context or the occasion of or is referred to as occasions of the revelation in relation to particular text is helpful for us to understand what exactly the verse is talking about. And then we have a whole lot of this area of the Meccan and Medinan verses. This is also about context, isn't it? Meccan verses, Medinan verses. And what was revealed first, what was revealed last. Again, these are topics that are discussed in what is called usul al-tafsir, or the principles of tafsir. Then in fiqh, also there's a lot of emphasis on taking context into account. Now, if you may be the greatest scholar of fiqh, but if you don't know the context, you're not supposed to issue fatwas. Someone asks you about, what should I do? You have to understand the context. Just having an excellent understanding of the Qur'an and Hadith and usul al-fiqh is not sufficient for you to issue fatwas. Because the fatwa might be coming from someone in KL or someone from Singapore or someone from Melbourne. And there are people who issue these fatwas, so-called, Google sheikhs, internet sheikhs. So the people ask questions, you should do X, Y, Z. But what is the context of the person? And again, this is a big debate in fiqh. I can give plenty of other examples, but the point is, in our tradition, in fiqh, in tafsir, and other disciplines, there is a lot of emphasis on context. So the contextualist approach is not doing anything radically new. It is rooted in the tradition. It is a principled approach. It has principles that actually keeps that very much in line with what is expected of anyone who is trying to approach the Qur'an and its interpretation. It doesn't ignore the linguistic meaning. In fact, it says the linguistic meaning is the starting point. And it also says that one shouldn't play linguistic gymnastics with the text. One should be faithful to in terms of understanding what the text actually meant. And also says that you have to look at what other scholars have said about the text in the past. So there are lots of details, but I won't bore you with that. In the book I mentioned a four-step analysis. Basically, let me give just a very brief idea, then we'll have some discussion. I sort of gave these details to help those who are interested in the approach to apply that in a reasonably easily kind of manageable fashion. The first step is very much to recognize our own limitations when we engage with a text like the Qur'an. When we interpret a text of the Qur'an, we actually bring into the interpretation a lot of baggage. Our own likes, dislikes, presuppositions, our hopes. It's basically all in our head. That is the total experiences that we had in life, which is stored in here. We can't escape from that. We can't keep that aside when we read a particular Quranic text, because we don't even have access to that. Most of that functions subconscious level. So when we read the Quranic text, that actually comes into the picture. We also recognize that language is something very complex. Some of us think that language is very simple. You want to understand a text, you look at the word, check the dictionary, and understand the text. Language is not that simple. If you think of spoken language and written language, if I say something now, I'm saying that in a context. You hear what I'm saying, you are seeing my body language, you are interpreting what I'm saying based on all of this. Spoken language in that sense has this added dimension, a richness that doesn't exist in a written text. When you reduce spoken language to writing, we actually lose that contextual information. Then, if the written text is removed from the time when it was spoken, the further we go away, the more removed we are from that context. And we kind of reimagine that context quite a lot. And that reimagination would be, and reconstruction would always be an approximate thing, because we can't actually recreate that original moment. So when we read the Qur'an, we need to keep in mind that there's a lot of context that is missing. We don't have access to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. We don't have access to the time. We don't have access to the people. We don't have access to what was going on in the early 7th century. And we have a rough idea of some of that based on historical information that we have, but that is always going to be an approximate thing. So there's room for us as Muslims who see the Qur'an as our guide, as God's word, to actually try to make sense of that. We have room for that. In fact, in our tradition, Muslim scholars of tafsir have done a lot of work on this. And if you look at commentaries on the Qur'an, you find different commentaries have different emphasis because different scholars come from different backgrounds. Someone with a very heavy legal background would have that emphasis in their commentary. I mean, Qurtubi is an example. Fiqh is a very big part of that. Tabari has his emphasis. Zamakhshari has his emphasis, very heavily linguistically based. So it depends on what kind of background these scholars have. And similarly, in the modern period, when all of us actually read the Qur'an, our background is actually shaping the way we actually thinking about that, and we're trying to make sense of that. Coming back to the steps, so once we actually have that recognition of our own limitations, the complexities of language and meaning is very complex, then we go to the second step. Second step is really very much to ensure that the text that we are dealing with is historically reliable. As far as the Qur'an is concerned, for Muslims, there is no question about its reliability and authenticity. But if you're dealing with hadith, we have to make sure that it is reliable and authentic and the like, because this approach can be applied to hadith as well. The third step is the most difficult and most complex one, because here we are looking at the linguistic meaning of the text. We are analyzing the text, the grammar, the meaning, the morphology, the syntax, the semantics, the stylistics. All these are linguistic aspects of the text. Because the way we put words together make a significant difference in terms of their meaning, isn't it? And also how words were used, the shifts in meaning that happened over time. We look at what other similar texts exist in the Qur'an. For example, chapter 4, verse 34, الرجال قوامون على النساء. Are there any other similar verses in the Qur'an on this topic? Are there hadiths on this topic? So bring all of that together to have a better understanding of what the Qur'an is talking about. We look at the immediate context of the text, what's before, what's after. And we try to understand, we try to see if there's any historical information that could help us get a better sense of the context of the time. What was the society like? What was the political situation like? What were the kinds of issues and the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the earliest Muslim community were dealing with at the time when this particular verse was revealed? What were the issues? What was the economic situation like in this particular Quranic verse? Well, what was the situation of women like and men like? So getting all these kind of historical information is very important. There are lots of other steps, but after all this analysis, we try to understand the text as best as we could in terms of how the very first recipients of the Qur'an, that is the Sahaba and the Prophet, actually understood the text. This would be an approximate thing, but based on the evidence, what was the understanding like? And then we look at how this particular verse was understood throughout our tradition by different Muslim scholars in different periods and different contexts. Again, trying to be as faithful as possible to the tradition. We come to an understanding of the text, and then we see what our own context like, and then how the understanding that was arrived at early on can be related to our context today. In this case, الرجال قوامون على النساء, that particular verse, is it talking about equality or inequality of man, women, or is it talking about something completely different? Is there a possibility of understanding that text slightly differently to the way our tradition understood that? Do we have sufficient support in our understanding? We might come up with an interpretation of the Quranic verse, but then we have to ask questions. This is kind of, we get into step 4 here. We ask ourselves a number of questions. Is this understanding that we arrived at, or interpretation we arrived at, is it reasonable? Can that be considered authoritative? To what extent we can rely on this interpretation? Would this interpretation be accepted by the broader interpretive community? Again, we have to, explore these questions, and after a lot of these analyses, we arrive at an interpretation, which is a contextual or contextualist interpretation. Now, as you can see, this is a lot of work. It deals with a lot of analysis. It deals with the linguistic meaning. It tries to be as faithful as possible to the tradition. It is trying to make sense of a very important text that has relevance to our life, and we are trying to see how we can relate to that, how that can relate to us. It is a principled approach. It is not, well, where anything goes. This is not about relativism or relativistic approaches or some postmodernist approach to the Quran. It is very careful with the tradition, faithful to the tradition, but it doesn't blindly follow the tradition. Where there's a need to move away from that, it will. But it will always keep an eye on broader Quranic objectives. It will not go against the halal and haram specified in the Quran. It will not question the fundamental beliefs of Muslims. It will not question the fundamental practices of Muslims, like the prayer, the fasting, pilgrimage, and the like. It will not question the fundamentals of the religion and law, for instance, protection of life, protection of property, and the like. So it has a lot of these, things that actually keep that very much as part of the tradition, but tradition that is relevant to the modern context. I think I should stop here. Thank you so much.